This
Mariso,
meeting is being recorded.
Potter,
Here.
Ryder,
Here.
Fisher.
Here.
Okay, thank you, Clerk Ellis. We have quorum and 5 members of the commission present, so we will proceed with the meeting tonight and go with general public comment. And the commission will hear public comments on matters over which it has jurisdiction. And folks can raise their hand and they will get 3 minutes for items not on the agenda.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. I see Taryn Obaid has her hand up. Taryn, I've allowed you to speak and I will share my timer for 3 minutes. Taryn, you'll need to unmute yourself and I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Hi there, good evening. This is Taryn Obaid of Petaluma, California. And I just wanted to make a general comment to call the Planning Commission's attention to an email that was requested to be forwarded to you. Yet we haven't seen confirmation that it was forwarded to you. So I just want to make sure you do get your hands on it. It was an excellent presentation on the river delivered by 3 people, David Keller, somebody named Christina Toms, who's with, I think, Bay Area Water Quality Management, and one other person who I don't recall, but the forum was Know Before You Grow, and it happened about 2 months ago. And it was forwarded to all of the GPAC members. And this is the most amazing presentation that explains how Petaluma Valley is actually a sink basin with multiple creeks all funneling down into the Petaluma River, which is why the entire valley is a flood, basically a flood zone. And there was some really brilliant discussion on how planning, best practice planning, most forward thinking for climate change consideration to protect our lives and to protect our property is to reach for looking beyond FEMA maps and to overlay multiple types of hazard maps that apply the most holistic forward thinking. And that being not just flood, not just fire evacuation, but also things like that we don't normally think about, probably don't at all think about, which is the relationship between bees and plants and harvest volume and the trees that are needed to house the birds and the whole ecological system. So I clearly can't articulate it that well. I'm not a specialist, but this was a presentation that should have made it to your inbox in maybe the last 5 days. So please be on the lookout for it. And I encourage you to watch it. It actually super impressed me, clearly. It was really the most brilliant thinking on our valley that I've seen. And I would encourage the Planning Commission to please embrace it and to take bold steps to move us in a direction that thinks beyond the backward-looking FEMA maps and to really piecing together different frameworks to come up with the tightest grand framework to base planning decisions on. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Taryn. Up next, we have Susan Kirks. Susan, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself and I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Hi, thank you, Eric. Susan Kirks, Petaluma. I really enjoyed Taryn's comment, and that's why I raised my hand. I'm listening in on your meeting like I often do to stay up to date and learn about what the Planning Commission is involved in. I wanted to segue, I guess, from Taryn's comment to advise the Planning Commission that just today I completed something I've been working on for several months called We Are All Connected. It's a wildlife corridors and crossings mapping for the Petaluma area and South Sonoma County. And I'm going to be preparing some written comments to go with the mapping, hoping to give some presentations in the community to any groups or organizations who are interested in knowing where our wildlife corridors are in Petaluma. How do our wildlife move? Where are the areas along Highway 101 that need to be modified to facilitate wildlife crossing? And this seems to be a complement to what Taryn was talking about, because on either side of the river and in the areas of the creeks as well, we have terrestrial presence, land, including significant grassland, and knowing how and where to plant trees for carbon sequestration or to leave grassland as it is as open space, and where these corridors are to facilitate movement should be a really helpful planning tool. I was really glad to hear Taryn say that she had forwarded the presentation she attended to the GPAC, because I think the General Plan Advisory Committee is very key in forward-thinking planning and prioritizing our environmental areas, which also intersects with the climate action framework that's been adopted by the city. So this work that you may see, and I may provide it to some of you, I haven't quite decided how we'll distribute it, but it's based on 21 years of Paula Lane Action Network's detailed work in receiving information about species sighting for American badger and other wildlife, verifying living and deceased sightings, and also observing wildlife movement patterns. And it has taken that long to be able to, with confidence, do this mapping. So I look forward to sharing that with you at some point and hope that you will see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, it appears that was our last speaker for general public comment, so I'll pass it back to Vice Chair Alonso.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And we will move through the agenda to agenda item number 4, which is commission comment. And we will start with Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. The council did meet last night. We're meeting 4 times in June. Relevant to this body is that we did adopt the draft VMT implementation guidelines as recommended by this group. And that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Fisher, for the update. We will ask Commissioner Hooper to give an update for PBAC, please.
We had a pretty exciting PBAC meeting. A few of the items that we ended up covering included a presentation from Councilmember McDonald and Ken, the traffic engineer, with regards to PBAC-related items for the Goals and Priorities workshop. We also covered active transportation projects that are going to be coming up in the next fiscal year, which included a little over $10 million collectively in the proposed allocations. And we also looked at active projects along Rainier, where we recommended removing some of the parking alongside both sides of the street in order to actually protect bicycle lane, in order to actually install protected bicycle lanes. And we know that's going to be a bit difficult and require a lot of community input, but we're excited to see where that process goes. And then we got a lot of good news with regards to the bike and pedestrian master plan, which is moving forward, and we should have a presentation on in the coming meetings. So we're pretty excited for that. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Hooper. And Commissioner Marzo is absent tonight, and tonight is his last meeting, or would be his last meeting. So we will be getting a new commissioner at our next July meeting, and we thank Commissioner Marzo for his 8 years of service on the commission. He served 2 full terms, and he will be sorely missed. With that, we'll need to select new liaisons from this body at our next meeting, in addition to, I believe, a new chair and vice chair as well. So stay tuned for that. And we will move along, or any other commissioners making to wish comment? Okay.
Yes, I
Commissioner
did
Potter.
want to acknowledge the public speaker and let them know that we did receive the presentations on the Petaluma River via email, and I agree with all the comments that were made. It was really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to having all of that knowledge to inform our efforts for better planning in Petaluma related to the river and its ecology and hydrology.
Thank you, Commissioner Potter. Anyone else wishing to make comment? Okay, we will move along to our next agenda item, which is the planning manager report from Planning Manager Hines.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Just a few updates. I also wanted to thank Commissioner Marzo, and I'm sorry he's not here for his last meeting, but he has been on this commission, like Chair Alonso said, for 8 years through a lot of different projects and a lot of great legislative efforts that have come out of this commission in the last couple of years. So he will be missed, and we look forward to welcoming our new commissioner at our next meeting. Additionally, both Vice Chair Alonso and Chair Bauer have been reappointed for another term with the Planning Commission. So happy to have them continue to sit on this commission with all of you. Let's see, we touched on the VMT implementation that was adopted by Council last night. Also, they approved a resolution with the general plan amendment to reference the local hazard mitigation plan that was before this commission for recommendation at your last meeting. And then let's see, next Monday is the citywide goal prioritization. So what I believe it comes out this evening, the packet for that, it is an update on the status of all the goals and priorities from the last goal setting, and really focusing in on those things that have not been initiated or are in progress, in a feedback loop on if they haven't been initiated, why? Is there a barrier? Is it you know, why hasn't it come to the top yet? Or if it's in process, what's the status, what we anticipate is needed to finish it. And then additionally, as I believe you all know, things come up that we didn't foresee when we set those goals and priorities. So staff also worked to identify the different things that have come up since that we have been working on, or we think might be a priority to be working on, given feedback from the community. So that is next Monday's council meeting. And then I also just wanted to give you all an update that the city, in partnership with Danco Communities and SMART, submitted a grant application through Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities for approximately $30 million between the affordable housing projects. So that is Danco is the AB 2162 supportive housing and affordable housing project at the future Corona station. So it was an application for $20 million for the actual affordable housing project, and then $10 million for grant funding for the station and other bike and ped improvements in the area. So that application was submitted at the beginning of June, and we anticipate hearing back in October on that funding. So we are cautiously optimistic. And that's what I have for staff update.
Great, thank you, Planning Manager Hines, for that update. And we will move along to agenda item number 6, which is the approval of the meeting minutes from our last meeting, which was on May 25th, 2021. Does any commissioner have any edits or suggestions to the minutes? And seeing no one come forward, we will approve the meeting minutes as submitted. So thank you, Clerk Ellis, for your work on that. And we will continue on here on this Tuesday evening to item number 7, which is new business, and we will hear from staff on item letter A, which is zoning text amendments, discussion and feedback on scope of anticipated zoning text amendments to modify chapter 24.
Bear with me for a second while I find my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. So good evening. So this item, staff is in the process of working on amendments to chapter 24 of the implementing zoning ordinance. And while we're working on them and finalizing the formal zoning text amendment package, thought it would be a good feedback loop to check in with the Planning Commission to see if there's anything that the commission specifically feels like staff should look into, explore, incorporate into modifications, given the essential role that the Planning Commission plays in many of the aspects of Chapter 24. So Chapter 24 deals specifically with the administrative procedures associated with entitlements. So it talks about site plan and architectural review, conditional use permits, variances, appeals, and then within each of those subsection, it talks about what the review process is, requirements for what to consider or findings. Some of them talk about noticing. But what you find in Chapter 24 is there's a real lack of consistency between the different sections. Some of them reference noticing, some sections don't reference noticing at all. Findings or considerations. So there's really been minimal modifications to this chapter of the IZO, except for the recently adopted extended SPAR expiration for housing projects. And so it seemed like a good time to relook at this section. There's aspects of case law that have impacted our review authority that warrant looking at. Their state law, Senate bills and Assembly bills that have talked about streamlining that maybe impact this section. We have adopted, for instance, the public outreach resolution that the council approved, which hasn't been codified. So it seemed like a good time to come back and look at this fundamental chapter of our code. So while we're looking at them, we wanted to bring before the Planning Commission for, before we bring it for your formal consideration and recommendation, we thought it would be good to get discussion and feedback from this body to help staff inform what they're looking at. Currently, staff is looking at amendments to look at updates to the SPAR findings in order to reference the general plan consistency, which currently our SPAR findings do not reference the general plan. Also environmental review requirements to make sure that we are preserving the authority to utilize environmental review to the maximum extent possible, including reference to future adoption of the objective design standards, which we are also working on and which would augment our standard SPAR findings. Looking at the conditional use permit considerations that are outlined in the code, creating consistency between each section, referencing decision-making body, noticing requirements, hearing requirements. Also looking to codify the public noticing requirements consistent with that city council resolution. And also to establish procedures for inactive projects. Currently, we do not have any procedures when a project is in review and sits inactive for any amount of time. We do not have a procedure to consider that project automatically withdrawn. So looking at establishing some of those procedures as well. So this is kind of a short list, a summary of some of the things staff has identified. And welcoming feedback and discussion with the Planning Commission on other things that maybe the Commission has been frustrated with as part of their review of projects, or felt like they didn't have enough support from the code to dive in as much as they would like to on certain things. So that's why we're before you this evening. So I'm going to run through these slides, and then I believe what we'll do is we'll take public comment, and then we can come back to any of these for specific discussion with the commission. And really, I've pulled out a few questions or prompts. This in no way limits the Planning Commission's discussion, but more gives some things that might be helpful to start the discussion. So with reference to site plan and architectural review, looking at the considerations, findings that are outlined in the code, and really are they adequate? Do they give the Planning Commission the depth to guide their project review and consideration? These are very subjective considerations. They talk about quality materials, what the appropriate architectural style is, the siting of the structure, signs, the location and size of signs, the bulk and height and color of structures within the neighborhood and compatibility with the immediate neighborhood. There's a brief reference to landscaping to approve city standards. And then it also touches these considerations under SPAR, touch on ingress, egress, internal circulation, and specifically does reference automobiles, bicycles, and pedestrians. Our code also in chapter 24 under site plan and architectural review, and again under conditional use permit, has both what we tend to call major SPAR and minor SPAR. So the administrative or minor SPAR is done at the staff level. It still does get noticed. It gets noticed to a smaller radius, but does get a public notice. It does require consistency with all the same findings, but it doesn't come to a public hearing. And so this is often, process can be a huge tool for streamlining desired types of projects, because what we hear consistently is the time and costs associated with process can be a real key consideration to applicants. So the existing scope of administrative SPAR is pretty limited. Residential units in approved subdivisions of 5 or more lots, non-productive residential units. Whoops, I got ahead of myself. It does allow residential development of less than 5 units. So this does allow for site plan and architectural review of a project that's maybe a triplex, duplex to be approved administratively, not with a full public hearing. This is something that we recently used for a 3-unit work-live project on Court Street. So it is something that we have used to reduce time and processing to try to get housing units approved, but it does limit us to less than 5 units. It also allows for minor additions or modifications to existing industrial, commercial, or office buildings. So maybe that's, an addition off the back or a facade renovation on an existing non-residential building. But that's really the extent of what is done as administrative SPAR. So similarly with conditional use permit, are there other specific considerations that may be helpful to guide the Planning Commission's review of conditional use permits? Currently, it references siting of the building, adequacy of the site to accommodate the use that's proposed, screening of outdoor activities, intensity of activity, and the traffic and circulation and parking. Calls out hours of operation, special hazards that might arise from the intended use, and ability to see the use permit as public convenience and necessity. So this is kind of an abbreviated list of the considerations for conditional use permits, but are there things that we should be adding to this section to help with review of that type of entitlement? And then similarly, the list of what can be reviewed as minor use permits. So again, that administrative process still does noticing, still requires that findings are made consistent with the code. But these are the type of things that are approved at an administrative level. So changes to existing conditional use permits. So if a conditional use permit is been approved and perhaps they want to extend their hours or some sort of modification or enlargement to that use, that can be done administratively. The use permit for tasting rooms, which that was a section of the code that was added several years ago, allows authorized single family dwellings or the reestablishment of single family dwellings in some commercial districts, allowing for a conditional use permit that has expired within the last 2 years to be kind of reactivated through approval of a new use permit administratively. And then also wanting feedback, you know, the council approved the public outreach and notification resolution a couple years ago, which expanded the radius for major projects to 1,000 feet. You'll see reference in our code to 300 feet. We were, as practice, using 500 feet, and that resolution changed it to 1,000 feet for major projects. So looking to codify the intent of that resolution, so it is in our code. So is that been a positive? Is it reaching a wider range of the public to get involved in the entitlement process when a project is coming forward for a public hearing? Has the requirement for on-site signage been helpful to reach a broader audience? That is another thing that Petaluma did not require, and with the approval of that resolution began requiring that those big blue signs go up as well. And are there other public noticing tools that we should be considering or looking into to improve the entitlement process? And then finally, just, you know, as I said, those were really just some of the prodding questions to ask on some of the things at the top of our mind to get your input on. If there's other aspects when you looked at Chapter 24 and as the decision-making body on many of the entitlements that are covered in our administrative procedures chapter of the code, are there other things that we should be looking at or amendments are warranted to improve that entitlement process? So what we're recommending is that the Planning Commission discuss and provide feedback for desired amendments. We were asking for a continuation of this item so we could prepare and return with the formal package of amendments. Staff report reference July 13th, and we've extended that, asking for a continuation of a date certain to July 27th. Based on several items that are already agendized for the first meeting in July. So asking for a continuation to a date certain of July 27th for us to return with the package of amendments. And that is the conclusion of my staff report. Happy to actively engaged in discussion and feedback and input from the public that may be helpful for our effort.
Okay, thank you, Planning Manager Hines, for that PowerPoint presentation. We will open it up to public comment first, and then bring it back to the commission for comments and questions with the Planning Manager. So if Mr. Roberts could open public comment, we will proceed with that, and folks can have 3 minutes to speak on this agenda item.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. I don't see any attendees with their hands up. Oh, there is one, Taryn Obaid and Veronica O. First up is Taryn Obaid. I'll go ahead and share my timer. Okay, Taryn, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself, and once again, please state your name for the record.
Hi, thank you. It's Taryn Obaid again. Thank you for the opportunity for this input to make the process better. Recently, we've seen with a string of projects how that there are efficiency and outcome quality gains with more citizen involvement. So I'd like to add my suggestion or request for expanding out the noticing, not just in terms of geography, which I very much support, and I would even go beyond 1,000 feet due to cumulative impacts of all of the development we're seeing related to traffic, emergency evacuation, pollution, noise pollution, particulate matter pollution, things like that. But in the corporate world, we use something called project collaboration software. And it's been around for a solid decade or more, and I think it'd be perfect for us to use. Once an application is received, geographically, people that have registered with the system can all get a notice of when it's received. And then for each milestone, the citizens can be aware of where it is in the pipeline. I think that would absolutely be wonderful and cause less stress for both the city staff and citizens towards making projects better. A lot of times, even with that noticing sign up at the parcel, people don't see it. They don't see it tucked into a city alert news, next door post. And so many citizens feel like they're absolutely blindsided. And I think if we did one step further and employed this kind of basic functionality, which is super easy to code. I mean, I can even code it and I'm not a programmer. That would be a huge win at a low cost, I think, for a city. Also, I'd like to say, please do not expand permit due dates or because we're at 820% of our RENA for market rate and above. And I don't think we need to give the developers any more slack. We need to shut that down. That would benefit us. They can always reapply and pay the fee again. Also, with final staff reports, please, can we stop accepting reports from consultants such as traffic, such as arborists at Riverbend that said there were no mature trees there. Reports that get made all the way into a recommendation to approve a project that have no professional seal on them. There are lots of those that make it into the final documents, and that is not kosher, and we should not accept that. No more. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Taryn. Up next, we have Veronica O. Veronica, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself, and I'll ask you to state your name for the record.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. I just wanted to give some comments on SPAR. I would like to echo Taryn's comment about community outreach. I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve with community outreach? And if we are trying to get feedback from the community, that we need to increase the way that we're marketing projects and having a calendar system so that it's very easy for people to follow where things are. And also connecting projects to an alert of some kind other than just the sign. Maybe there's posters in the neighborhood. Maybe there's entry points that people are not online that could also access, so that it's more maybe of a what do they call it? An analog sort of notice system. And then also the other comment that I had in terms of the standards for review for applications, there are a lot of requirements in the steps. Number 4, I think it said to actually have the context of the development in the plan. It would be really helpful to have some contextual mapping or contextual drawings for the projects so that the Planning Commission could access that when they're making the decision and make decisions more informed of how this is going to impact the neighborhood and what the neighborhood is like. And And the other thing was the good design character on number 4. I was wondering, how does that get determined? What is good design character? There are a lot of definitions in the chapter 24 that are very vague, and how do you actually implement those? So there's a lot of things to discuss about this document. I think that maybe could provide questions for like how would we actually get to an end that we want, and maybe we're working backwards and we say, okay, we want this neighborhood to look like this, and we have a discussion about it, and we look at what are the elements that we're looking for, so that when a project comes in, we go, oh, okay, this slots into what we were looking at. So anyway, I know it's a complex topic and there are many things to consider, but I just feel like there's a lot of open-ended kind of very subjective things in chapter 24 that could be difficult to determine when you're planning a project. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment, Veronica. Up next is Chris JRN. Chris, I've allowed you to speak. I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Hi there, my name's Christopher Neugebauer. I've only been a listener to Planning Commission somewhat recently, but I've already noticed a few cases where I've seen the Planning Commission's hands effectively tied by past decisions where the intent of the Commission and of the City Council wasn't really properly captured in decisions that were made that led to developments. The one I'm thinking of in particular was the approval of the Auto Mall sign recently, where we saw that the zoning for the Auto Mall did not capture the intention of the council at the time as to what the sign would be used for, and so you had no choice but to approve a sign that really didn't fit with the city's character. So I'd encourage these discussions to consider not just the design and placement of signs, but also the purpose of those signs, ensuring that the intention is captured so that developers don't just change their mind for what a sign might be used for after approval. I also want to associate myself with the comments made by Taryn. I saw in the East Washington Place discussion recently that noticing requirements for particular development didn't really reach a meaningful group of people. 1,000 feet from that particular location really only captures people on the opposite side of the freeway, basically 10 minutes drive away from the location, which, while meeting the letter of the law, really doesn't meet the spirit of properly informing the community. I would encourage the city to revisit how it provides notice on community engagement for development, so that people who are actually relevant to projects are informed, rather than people who just happen to be within a straight line on a map. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Chris. And I believe that concludes our public comment on this item. Vice Chair Alonso, back to you.
Okay, thank you for folks weighing in tonight on this agenda item, and thanks for Mr. Roberts for moderating. And we will bring it back to the commission for any questions or comments. Again, this is essentially a study session item, and decisions will be made on July 27th if approved in a motion tonight. So let's see, hands up. We got Commissioner Hooper. Do you want to lead us off?
Yes, I would love to, Chair Alonso. I have a few questions and a few comments. Some of what I want to start with actually dovetails well off of some of the comments already made. And one question I had, because noticing has come up before, what are the current requirements for noticing? I understand the 1,000 feet, but just the method outside of just posting in the newspaper. Are there restrictions to what you can do, or is there just a minimum that's currently assigned?
There is a minimum, and so for a project that is a major project and coming before this commission, the requirement is that 1,000-foot radius of the project site. So that is taken from the outline of the parcel that the project is on. And that is something that we use our GIS system for. So it basically outlines the project site and then does a radius, and within 1,000 feet, any parcel that it touches, that is then part of our noticing. And when there is a address for an owner that is different from the site address of the parcel, we send it both to the parcel and to the owner of record. So in the hope that we get both property owners and occupants. We are also, we publish a notice in the Argus Courier. The Argus Courier is the local newspaper of record that was adopted by the city council. So that is the paper we use. And that gets published at least 10 days prior to the public hearing. And that notice, similar to the notice it's mailed, has a brief project description, an address, what is before the commission or the council or the Historic and Cultural Preservation Commission, and ways that somebody can participate, whether it's at the meeting, asking questions beforehand, looking at project information ahead of time, submitting a letter. It gives those options and a staff contact to contact with any questions. There is now the on-site public hearing notice that is also required. That the size of that varies depending on the size of the parcel. And some of that is we often will have a major project that is a single family home parcel. And so the size of that sign is different than a large major commercial site. It requires, if a project has multiple street frontages, it requires multiple signs, one for each frontage. And that is another requirement. When a project is not tied to a specific location, so for instance, something like a zoning text amendment, there is not a specific parcel to draw that 1,000-foot radius on when it applies citywide. So we are required to publish a larger notice in the paper. So it's an 8th-page ad when it is an item of citywide concern. So those are the requirements for public notification. We attempt to do additional things like trying to create on our major project page information about projects, to get information out in those weekly community newsletters that go out, and other ways as we come up with. But those are the requirements that are within the resolution adopted by the city council.
So thank you. That all sounds like a great deal of work, and I'm very appreciative of that. The one thing I'd like to say is that seems like a great deal of work for modes of information that a lot of people in the city aren't using as thoroughly. Like the project plan website, I very much appreciate as a planning commissioner. As a regular member of the public, I would be hard pressed to find 5 people who know what that page is or where it is on the website. I think if we're really trying to do outreach on these projects, Petaluma, for example, is broken up into multiple next door neighborhoods. Standard methods of social media are quite accessible for most people. I think if you're really going to have set up new minimums for how you notice this, and you're doing all of that work, which, don't get me wrong, I think is very important and necessary for meeting bare minimums, but if there isn't that corresponding digital outreach, you're going to miss people. And even the newsletter, I think that's a great addition by the city. It's still slowly being adopted. And I think this also connects to a separate issue, which I want to stress. I really appreciate the work that goes into it, but I think is going to prove to be a problem for some folks, which is the reports that come out. While a lot of content is there, there's not, especially for the public, there's not enough effort to make it more plain spoken and less filled with acronyms and have more accessibility in terms of the documents being referenced. Like the report for this item, for example, it really wasn't clear that this was a study session. It really wasn't clear what we were going to do at this meeting other than kind of generally discuss some of these points. Some documents not in section 24 are referenced but not easily linked, so people have to go and find that on the website. And I would just strongly recommend that the reports, as much as they're informative for us, but they be treated like another important document that people are going to get to and are great for setting up context. And I know that's extra time and extra work, but I think if you're taking the time to put this in all these different places to have different directions pointing back to these documents, especially on the project plan website, that extra step will be really important to make all that work kind of pay off for folks who aren't necessarily directly engaged there on a regular basis. I also think the digital side of that, especially with Nextdoor posts, especially with social media, some of these projects, we've noticed people care well outside of their own radius, and it's a great way for people to access it without feeling like something's being hidden from them. Moving away from, oh, and I just wanted to say I appreciate the sign noticing. I had nothing to add there other than I have noticed how much that's expanded on certain projects. I think that is really informative for folks. Another item I wanted to bring up had to do with, actually, sorry, I have like 5 or 6 here, so it's just.
Yeah, Commissioner, can I just interject real quick? I think maybe just, and I apologize for not setting the tone for this item appropriately. Maybe we could do this by topic as Heather put in her slides, so we can just weigh in on each slide as we go forward, so we can hear from everybody. So why don't we just keep the theme going and go with the noticing slide and hear from other folks. Does that work okay, Heather, for you? So
Yeah.
we can. Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I should have said that at the top, but thank you, Commissioner Hooper. Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you, and thank you for doing that. I was raising my hand going, can we do themes, please? Because I want to follow up on council member, no, I'm at a commission meeting. Hello. It was a very late night last night and I didn't get my sleep. On Commissioner Hooper, it says it right there. I could just look. The noticing for major projects, what is the noticing for minor projects? Is it the same as major projects or is it a different radius?
It's 500 feet.
Okay. I think the idea of, so going back to Taryn's point and the fact that we put major projects on the city's website, I actually don't find that very useful. I've gone in to look and I guess the question is the software that the city uses that you as a department use to track your projects. Is there any way, well, first of all, if you could tell me what that is, and then if there's any way to make that more transparent. So when somebody files an application, presumably that you record it and then you record who's it been assigned to, and then, you know, what the status is. And
I actually think so. The city is in the process of moving to a new permit tracking software. And I believe, and I'm not the expert on this, but I believe that one of the things that will happen with that is there will be more of a public interface with that. So I'm happy to follow up on that. I don't have that specifically off the top of my head, but we have been working a lot and we're moving to a new software program. And I think one of the things there will be like a public facing portal where you can then get information on projects, even building permits. So if you see something going on in your neighborhood and you're like, what's going on at, you know, the Smiths, you know, resident down the street or something like that, that you can look that up by address and get an idea of what they have a permit for. But I would, more than specifics in that, I'm going to have to follow back up on that.
Well, and if my neighbor were working, I would hope I would just go down and knock on the door and say, what you doing?
Yeah, I would hope so too, but we do get a lot of those kind of calls. What's going on down the street from me? So.
And one now signs up for the city newsletter if they want to receive it. Is there a way to and one can sign up to get agendas for the Planning Commission and notice of meetings? Is there any other information that one can sign up for through planning?
Well, there's constant contacts, which is when something is posted. And one of the things we have been working on, so we did do a new a website. Was it a year ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago? It all is kind of blurring together. But one of the things that we started looking into and is in process is whether there is, especially if there's a specific project, for you to be able to kind of sign up so that you get any notifications when things update on that project website. And even the ability theoretically to enter a comment through the website. So if you're on the website looking at a project that's in process, to, instead of then emailing or writing a letter, or to be able to enter and comment through that. But I'm not sure where the status of that is either. But those are some of the efforts we've been making and talking about, ways to kind of streamline and make it easier for people to get engaged instead of cumbersome.
Awesome. And then back to the comments about using Nextdoor. I would feel a little hesitant about that. I would rather see us use our own systems rather than a more public-facing social media system.
Yeah, I had the same initial, like, I get the intent of that, to get it kind of more of that blast out based on a neighborhood area, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how exactly to use that, but it was be something that we could explore or look at. Are there other options out there for us to have a similar concept?
Yeah, and it's my observation that Nextdoor is as popular as it is in Petaluma because we don't have other systems, right? You know, other than our new newsletter, which is, again, it's only less than a year old now, right?
It really kicked off during COVID.
Yeah, and that Nextdoor was really filling a void that the city wasn't already filling. So I want to see us sort of reclaim that. I think. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Fisher. And I think we can, there's really two questions I think Heather is asking us to weigh in on, is the public noticing radius of 1,000 feet for major projects, and then has the requirement for on-site signage for public hearings been helpful? So I think we're weighing in on both of those, but I just wanted to reiterate,
Yeah, and I would say also that there's some of this input that maybe isn't going to be codified, but is just good input for us to continue to be looking into and exploring and finding new ways. So I don't think you want to codify, you know, that every project will be noticed on Nextdoor, but I get the intent, and for us to continue to look at those options for constantly looking for new ways to reach people.
If you want me to weigh in on the signage and noticing, I think it works the way it is. But I do think we need to find other avenues. But I think the two existing ones are fine, as long as we expand the practice.
Sounds good. Thank you. Commissioner Potter.
Well, I guess Heather must have been reading my mind, because I feel like the item before us and what we'll be hearing again in July are the code amendments. And so my comments are that I think internal consistency is really important. I also believe that a council resolution laying out a process for public noticing should be consistently incorporated into the code. I do think it should be as inclusive as possible. So I support the 1,000-foot radius. And I also believe, even though I know it's a lot of work for staff and the signs are costly, that the on-site noticing is helpful for residents who are passing through. But I I agree that some of these tools that we could use for the website and for subscribing for noticing don't necessarily belong in the code, but maybe an internal procedures or practice could be developed and that could be shared with the commission. My final comment is that there are many cities now that have a geospatial sort of GIS type tool that can be used to look at the whole town and identify the sites that are under development in different phases. And so you can click on that and see what the status of the project is and when the hearing's coming. And it's really useful because it's not just for the residents, right? It's for people who want to come to this town and do business opportunities. They can see what's going on in the community or in the vicinity. And it's up to the city what they want to enter into the database. But I've seen it be a very useful tool for all parts of the planning process. I think that's especially important right now with so much of the housing having streamlined opportunities for development that aren't coming through our normal CEQA and Planning Commission hearing process. So if someone sees a project like that, they can go to this website and understand more the process that that project has followed, you know, because we're coming into an era where there are a lot of different paths for development to move forward. So those were my thoughts on the noticing.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Ryder.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks staff for the baseline information. This one's like so many administrative, a little complicated. So it's good to see it twice. For this initial comments, I echo several of the things already said by my fellow commissioners. In general, it seems like we wouldn't be harmed by having additional outreach. And I agree that codifying social media use doesn't make sense, but I love the idea of using it in practice, and I'm curious to see that pursued in some way. One thing that comes to mind related to the 1,000-foot radius, I wonder if there is a way to adjust that slightly, and certainly curious, Planning Manager Hines, if you're using just a strict radius, if there's a way to exclude roadway distances or require it to touch a property not classified as public space or something of that nature within that 1,000 square feet. So it's not just birds, as the bird flies measurements. Something of that nature so that you're making sure that it in fact is hitting the adjacent property that is not city owned. So just something of that nature might be an interesting adjustment along those lines. And otherwise, I haven't seen one of those signs in a while, but I believe that they're in at least 2 languages, and I applaud that. I find them very useful when I do come across them and drive my family crazy reading them. But I think that more participation, as the public comment said, is certainly better, will make for better projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryder, and I'll weigh in briefly and then we'll go back to Commissioner Hooper. I agree with my colleagues on their overall comments. I think the 1,000-foot radius is working great. Just now that I'm an old timer here on the commission, before the ordinance, we were getting lots of complaints that folks did not know about meetings, didn't know about large projects. The developer was not required to have a public meeting with neighbors. And so I think we're in a much better place today than where we were when I first joined. I know there's still obviously concerns about noticing and how folks find out information, but I think we're the staff and are doing a really good job. And I think in large part because the ordinance is working. I think one thing I do want to call out that I've noticed is that we should probably improve when the signs come down. Oftentimes these signs remain up. They become hotspots for graffiti and art, and so it just looks kind of odd too that, for instance, the project right by City Hall, the single family home there, that had to sign up for months after the project was over, even after the council meeting. So it just looks kind of weird that the sign just is there. So I just want to call that out. Maybe we need to be more specific that when the signs actually do come down. I also wanted to throw out there, it's not necessarily specific for what we're discussing tonight, but as a thought is perhaps, when the developer has their public meeting, maybe we need to think about when that meeting occurs, that it's not too far away before they come to the commission. So I think we've seen a few times where the applicant will have the meeting with the neighbors and then they come to the commission, but the project looks different, or some of the things that, it just doesn't, maybe not piece out. Obviously they're taking input, but I think we just want to be mindful that it's not, a year or 6 months before we see the project. So I don't know the right balance to that. I don't know what other jurisdictions do, but it's just something I think, again, the public meetings are super important, but just how we fine tune it.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because it's a balance. So we say that the way the resolution is written is that you can't be scheduled for a public hearing until you have your neighborhood meeting. And you want the neighborhood meeting to happen early enough so that there's really valuable input that can shift the project, right? So often we will hear, I've spent so much money or time modifying my project, and now I don't want to make any more changes, right? So we want to get the public input at those meetings when there's still a real openness to making modification and being part of that design and that shift, but not too early that an application that just got submitted necessarily, because there's a lot that happens in those first rounds of staff comments too about code requirements and just consistency with our regulations. So I acknowledge that is a tricky balance of when it happens.
Thank you. Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you. I just wanted to say briefly, just to clarify one of my other points, and I will be quick. The question is who you want to engage and how you want to engage them, and whether or not you want the same people you already have. If you want more people to adopt your platform, you have to meet them where they're at so they can access what you have and get in the habit of using it. The newsletter is expanded, but only so far. And I assure you there are far more people in this city using other mediums than ours, and they're not going to be forced onto it unless you come to them. You don't codify Nextdoor, you don't codify a specific social media platform. That would be silly. I was just giving an example. What you do is codify something more generic to say existing or popular mediums at your discretion. In terms of concern over how that will go, you hard link the post or whatever the content is back to your platform. If the medium allows you to disable comments, you disable comments, or you state as a policy that you don't respond to comments. Either way, either way, your outreach is there. And it, again, points back to your platform, which is really important if you want, say, constant contact to be adopted or any kind of notification system. And I say this because I've set this up before for government entities, and other cities do this quite often. We are actually very behind here. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions for Heather on these two questions or topics? Okay. Thank you, everybody. Heather, do you need anything else from us on these, or?
No, and I will, some of these items, glad to kind of poke around more broadly than perhaps our immediate neighbors, to get some, like, here's some different ways some different jurisdictions have done it, or what the breadth of public noticing requirements they do. I know that the paper and the on-site sign and the mailed notices are kind of the standard minimums, but happy to explore that too. And Commissioner Hooper, if there's specific jurisdictions you think have just done an amazing job and want to email me, I'm happy to look at some specifics too.
Great. Thank you. All right. Should we start off with SPAR? Heather had some questions for us of, have the existing SPAR findings provided adequate depth to review and discussion? And then there was other references to consider updating to reference general plan consistency and environmental review requirements. And then also about objective design standards. Do you want to say anything first, Heather, on that one?
Well, so with objective design standards, we are, in process of doing that. So I thought creating obviously the section where that would get inserted for those streamlined projects. Also, I think it was Veronica in the public comment talked a lot about the kind of the subjectivity of our SPAR findings. And I do agree. And design is one of those things that can be quite subjective. What a lot of jurisdictions do is they have guidelines by specific neighborhoods, and that is something that could be looked at in the future. It's kind of beyond what we're doing right now with this code, but it's a great way to get specific guidelines for neighborhoods. So you're looking at design specific to an area, neighborhood, quadrant, whatever it might be, however it is defined. So I guess the question with the subjectivity, is there things that within the scope of updating this section the commission would find helpful? Are there things, both the general plan consistency and the environmental review abilities have been things that have come up through different project review. And so those are the two things that were really top of my mind to respond to comments that have come up, or frustration with those aspects of our SPAR findings.
Thank you, Heather, for setting the stage for this discussion topic. Let's start off with Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. I've been on here such a short period of time that I just don't have that much experience with site plan, with SPAR. Lucky I know what it means, actually. And only if it comes to council have I have that much familiarity with it. But I guess I have two questions about siting and compatibility. I was always frustrated as a planning consultant that so many architects work in isolation. So they look at their site and they're just looking at their site, right? They're not looking beyond the boundaries. And so that compatibility issue was you could always tell it's sort of a good architect or an architect that was aware of their surroundings versus one that wasn't. It was like, no, this is the program the developer wanted and this is the site, so I'm going to put it right here, with sort of no regard to what is around it. And so so do we ask for maps or plans or anything else that shows how it would be compatible or not? I guess that's the first question. And then the second question is about siting. And I've never really understood the siting issue. I would like to see that we require buildings to be sited in a way so that they're more environmentally productive, right? So that, you don't have the sun coming in from the western facing windows. There's words for all this. And I'm not going to be able to grasp them tonight, but you know what I mean, right? So
yes,
passive design,
passive solar, yeah.
Thank you. And other things like requiring awnings, on those faces that have the sun during the day and that kind of thing, or deciduous trees, or so that's what I always think about when I look at siting requirements. I'm not sure what our requirement, what ours is in here that says it shall be. I don't know if I can get to the language. that the siting of the structure on the property as compared to the siting of other structures in the immediate neighborhood. And you know, given how some of our neighborhoods look, I wouldn't want to replicate what's in the neighborhood already. You know, some of those
Right.
70s subdivisions, you know, that there was no consideration to passive solar or siting, or, you know, it was, you know, again, one of those developers that was like, no, this is parcel, this is what the developer wants, this is what we're putting in. So
Well, I would say to some of that too, it's often like what the setback is, and there's some neighborhoods that maybe you don't want to continue what the dominant pattern is, but there are some neighborhoods that you do want to continue. And if everything is set up at a, you know, a 5-foot setback, you don't want something set back 20 feet, or, you know, vice versa. So some of that is the siting, the way, you know, those development patterns, and trying to make it compatible. I think siting is a big thing too in our commercial areas. You want the building sited up closer to the street to interact with the street, with the parking behind, or do you want the building set back and the parking in front? I think obviously the former, not the latter. But those are some of the focuses, I think, that the way this is worded in our SPAR findings, because it seems more related to that. But I think some emphasis or focus on the citing for environmental could be a really good adding some words in there to capture that.
and for, you know, pedestrian orientation, right? You know, engagement to the street, language like that, so that you're not setting it back, that you are setting it right up to the sidewalk, if that's appropriate for a commercial structure. And it's, you know, it's always difficult to codify it and to, you know, have a one size fits everybody. But if we could just, you know, talk about what our intent is and what we want the city to actually look like. And then I just have a comment about our section on bicycles and cars and compatibility. And I think we really need to expand that language to basically alternative modes of transportation, right? You know, these kids on scooters, they need to be paid attention to as much as the people on bicycles. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Fisher. Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you very much. And coming at it from a simple perspective, because SPAR is one of those things that I'm very much still learning and actively trying to engage with. One thing before going further, the thing that I've really latched onto the most is that SPAR is very much the checklist in terms of things that you need to cover for your project that kind of gets resolved in a lot of ways before there's a larger discussion. Just want to make sure that that aspect of my understanding is correct before I move forward.
Well, so there is a lot of discussion before an application comes before the Planning Commission, and that includes both the things that are requirements under our code and what we call advisories. So there are also things that staff early on will encourage and recommend that modifications be made, but sometimes we don't have the teeth to require it. So sometimes, and you will notice that in some of our nuanced recommendations or questions, or the way we lay things out, when there has been a situation where staff has recommended that an applicant look at design differently, or look at more, more articulation, or going taller, or, whatever it is. But we don't have the requirement to say, no, we're going to recommend denial because you didn't do this. So it can be kind of a nuanced discussion. And sometimes we make give early feedback that is disregarded, and that's sometimes you'll see things before you that we don't have the code backing to not bring forward, but we're looking for the commission to get some of that nuance, I guess.
Thank you for the clarification, because I've certainly noticed that on recent projects here where it feels like especially when it comes to environmental considerations, we're going to dovetail close to it. But one thing I keep finding myself wondering is it would be great if some of these things were incorporated into that. I'm framing this like a checklist. I get that it's more than that, but that's just the simplistic frame I've got in my head. And with that in mind, one thing that comes up on here, well, there's a few things. I promise, Vice Chair Alonso, this is all environmentally related. One thing has to do with landscaping. Like, this will come up and we will say we want, drought tolerant and kind of move for wildfire prevention, like the trees that are being implemented or the plants that are there. But one thing I'd really love to see in the checklist is just overall water consumption over time. I don't know if that's an easy thing to implement, but I think as we're going into perpetual drought season, that is one thing that would be helpful to see. Another thing with regards to tree removal, this one's been a little frustrating too, because it seems like the mitigations often feel vague. And this is an area where I know I just don't have the full backing of what someone else might have who's more of a specialist. But for example, removing an existing tree versus planting so many newer of either the same species or another, how much does that really implement or make a dent in what we've taken away in terms of kind of the CO2 exchange that would have been that much more capable with the tree we had? Things like that where the mitigation doesn't quite feel right. And it'd be great to have either requirements for some kind of threshold, measurable threshold we're going for, or more background for the mitigation required, just because sometimes it feels like we're just throwing options out there of, well, don't worry, we're going to plant these other trees later and we'll be fine. And that always gives me kind of a squishy feeling when we're going through it. Overall, water consumption is something that I really wish our projects were measuring. I know that might go a bit beyond the SPAR. I wanted to throw it out there though. And with regards to pedestrian and bicycle, because this was also on my mind, in the section 24, that talks about having PBAC review. Having been through several of those meetings, it often feels like because the language is vague, it's not, we can provide a clarification or recommendation, but I know for that committee, sometimes they're hesitant as how far they can go and how pointed they should be. It'd be great to have more expansion there to really crystallize the role. It'd also be great to see certain conditional checklists added into this process where, for example, I'm throwing out a common criticism that pops up, but there is always a reason for a bulb out. No matter what project we have, that comes off more often than not. But I realize how reductive that comment is. But I'm just saying it would be great to have some kind of if this, then that not recommendation, but guidelines ahead of time to be able to clarify for those projects, just because sometimes it seems so general that I feel like we're losing track and really adding pedestrian-friendly infrastructure as we go. And then I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to comment on this topic? Commissioner Ryder.
Yeah, so I actually have a couple of questions. Although all of my fellow commissioners always have such good commentary, I want to chime in. But my questions are more as I'm learning about this process as well, just kind of wondering about what we and what staff can do. So in particular, I'm wondering, does staff have the discretion to bring to the commission a project that maybe has unforeseen circumstances, even though it is classified as minor?
Yes, so we do have, the code always gives the authority to kind of elevate if needed. So there's things where we can refer it instead of, you mean if something could be approved administratively and it's technically it could, but yes, there are times that happens and we refer them up to the Planning Commission. And that sometimes because it doesn't feel right. It feels like it's more than the intent of the code was really meant to do, or if there is, a lot of public controversy or concern with the project, even though it's small by the code standard, we will refer it to the Planning Commission.
The Auto Mall sign was an example of that.
The Auto Mall sign was an example of that, yes.
Thank you. My first meeting.
I
All right.
apologize.
That's okay. I do really like the suggestions about having more clarity around intention and wherever possible metrics to follow those intentions. I know that is time consuming to create, but I think it will save a lot of heartache in the future if we can get those metrics correct. So love that idea. And the idea of conditional checklists is a fun one too. So thank you, Commissioner Hooper. I'm not sure if this is the right place for this particular comment, but I have also noticed, especially right now, as we are finishing the previous general plan, and where we have this tension where we don't want to be consistent or as consistent as we may have been 20 years ago with the general plan. And so is there any flexibility within our powers at the tail end of a general plan when it's about to expire to have just more discretion?
I think there is, and there you'll sometimes see. So one thing is, a project can be generally consistent with the general plan and not be consistent with every single policy and program in a general plan. So there's a lot in a general plan. And you will also actually, the item that is coming for a study session with this group at our next meeting is something that is kind of that interpretation exactly, that the world has changed. And so is this an appropriate substitution or not? So there are those times when we can balance those things a little bit more in the analysis. It's not a black or white. You know, I can't respond black or white in this situation, yes, and in this situation, no. I think there's nuances and there's gray and there's changes, and you know, in an ideal world, you're doing more regular kind of general plan report cards or, you know, updates to kind of reevaluate certain aspects of it to make sure it's keeping up and staying current.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryder. Commissioner Potter.
I really agree with many of the comments that have already been made. I think that the state and the city has been striving to develop more objective standards that is helpful. I think we're always sort of balancing the tension between having a very prescriptive code and having a vague code. And then that's the sweet spot that we have to arrive at. But I think including a general plan consistency and having environmental review is good. Some of the conversation, though, I'm not sure fits in the zoning code. So there are many other codes in the city that will regulate things such as the drought tolerant landscape through the water efficiency landscape ordinance or through the building code. And so maybe it's just a question of, in the staff report, when we have a project coming forward, that there's a little bit of education that once this project is entitled, it will have to go through all the stringent requirements on climate and drought and water usage and all those elements, you know, through another more ministerial process. So those are my thoughts about our standards.
Thank you, Commissioner Potter. I was wanting to say that specifically to a couple of Commissioner Hooper's, that we do have a water efficient landscape ordinance, and that is checked. It's checked initially during the SPAR process by our staff that specifically deals with water conservation. So they check it for certain things at the SPAR level, and then prior to issuance of the building permit, they dive in deeper and get really more specific to make sure it is meeting those. You know, our tree mitigation It is in a separate section of our code, but I don't disagree with you. And this has come up in several projects, and it is something also that as a planner and trying to implement the code and balance what you hear from the decision makers, an applicant can theoretically say, well, look, your code says I can mitigate this way or this way or this way. And knowing that our decision makers don't want you to take out the tree and replant twice as many small trees. They want you to plan around the trees that are there. So I think that might be another section of the code that might be, really appropriate for us to look at make sure it's keeping up with what we want to be seeing and our carbon neutrality and wanting to, sequester and preserve that. It's in a different section of the code, but it's not missed on me. I hear you.
Okay, Councilmember Fisher.
Well, I just want to say that maybe we can continue to have these study sessions about those other sections of the code that we want to change ahead of time, because that's one of my pet peeves, and also the wetlands mitigation, given the conditions that we're in. So I think there are a number of things that come up, at least in my tenure here, that I'd like to see change. So yeah, thanks.
Sounds good. All right, let's keep the conversation rolling. And another question that is asked of us is, are there any other specific considerations that may be helpful to specifically call out in considering conditional use permits? Heather, did you want to maybe just briefly set the stage for the CUP?
Yeah, the CUP, I feel like, has a kind of broader list of considerations. They're not put as findings, but they are considerations, and they really do run, now we're talking about land use. We're not talking about the design of a building. We're talking about a use that, and what I think is important to think about is a use that maybe sometimes is appropriate in that given zoning district that we'd be looking at, but isn't always appropriate. And so you're really looking at how do the specifics of the use, how do you want to consider whether or not in that case it's appropriate? So the code has quite a few considerations in it. It talks about noise. It talks about hazards to the neighbor. It talks about hours of operation and intensity and parking and traffic. And so it's got a pretty robust list. I think maybe some update to language and that kind of stuff, but I'm not sure if there's anything specific missing, but definitely open to if you noticed anything that you felt like was missing. Or we haven't had a lot of major use permits, but something to consider.
Thank you. Let's start off with Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. I don't actually have anything specifically on conditional use, but when we were looking at gas stations and, obviously the Safeway station, and it was a conditional use permit, and we said, okay, let's have staff look at, what it should be, and I'm really glad to where we got to. But the question is sort of more broadly in our code, those uses that are allowed by conditional use, wanting to review those, and I was hoping that would dovetail on the gas station discussion, but it hasn't. But my concern is that there would be other uses like gas stations that are allowed by conditional use in certain zones that these days we probably don't want to have them. So I'd like to look at this more broadly, or have staff look at it a little bit more broadly and say, okay, what are we allowing in what zones, and does that need to be modified?
So that's a different section of the code. And one thing to note about the Safeway gas station is it was not a conditional use permit. It was permitted by right. If it had been a conditional use permit in our code at that time, it would have provided a lot more discretion for the city to decide whether it was appropriate. And so that is chapter 4, and that's the table in our zoning code that basically outlines all of the uses and all of the zones, and in this zone, it's permitted by right, or it's a conditional use permit, or it's not allowed at all. So duly noted, and just for the record, just making sure that we're clear that a gas station was not a use permit, which was why it was very problematic, given that it was next to a school and a residential neighborhood, and there was very limited discretion that the city had on that project.
Yeah, and presumably, this will come after the general plan update because, all our zones will change and all the rest of it. So, okay, I'm going abroad here.
But it also, that comes into play. We talk about that. It's something that's come up a number of times around housing, how we, for instance, we allow single family detached housing in our more as permitted uses in our more higher density, what I would typically think of as more of a multifamily zone. We still allow those. So it kind of goes both ways too, right? You think of it as being the gas station, and you think of, a lot of people would say the single family home from a use standpoint is probably less impactful, but now also under the umbrella of our climate action framework and our, housing crisis and our carbon neutrality goals, it shifts that the opposite way. So different section of the code, but yes.
A lot of work to do.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember. Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you. One question I had to start, how is adequacy of parking measured for conditional use permits?
So it's typically whether it is meeting what the code requires for that use in Chapter 11. So Chapter 11 is what calls out all of the required parking by use. And so typically when you're looking at a conditional use permit, you're saying, are they providing enough parking per our code for that use?
I was wondering, given it seems, at least with some of the uses, this isn't something we want. That particular use isn't something we would want that location at all times. In some respects, to be quite temporary. And also, given we're trying to hopefully one day get rid of or reduce the parking minimum, I'm wondering, understanding separate code item, in this part, is there any way for us to either disconnect or add some kind of modifier to reduce parking minimums that are applied? I don't know if that's been such a significant issue because I haven't, since I've been on the commission, I haven't seen many of them. So I could be way out of line here, but I just wanted to start there.
Yeah, I think it's a good comment. I think we want to be cautious about creating inconsistencies in our code where one chapter says one thing and another chapter says another. And technically a project is supposed to be consistent with all the applicable sections of the code. I'd rather see us expedite the parking discussion, which we are close to coming and having. I don't like to think all we do is have study sessions, but that is a really big topic of conversation. And so we are probably, I'd say 75% there to creating a really robust conversation about that to come forward as a study session. So I think it would probably be a better approach to modify our parking requirements than do something that negates or creates an inconsistency in this section with another section.
Absolutely. If it's so close to coming up to the public for discussion, then absolutely. I just wasn't sure if that was actually ways off, and maybe this could be a middle ground item. The other question I had to do with traffic circulation. Is that also another scenario where this is connecting to another part of that particular use?
Well, I think what does it say? So we have standards, but I think it says traffic circulation and parking, and in particular the type of street serving the proposed use in relation to the amount of traffic expected, adequacy, convenience, and safety of provisions for vehicle access and parking, and the amount, timing, and associated truck traffic. So it's very vehicular focused in this conditional use permit section.
Thank you, because I had that up on screen, and part of why it comes to mind is because on one hand, I wonder if there's room for improvement to prioritize other modes of traffic, especially safety for other modes of traffic. I'm also, and this might be a far afield hypothetical, but I'm just thinking areas like East Washington or North McDowell that are kind of high traffic, difficult areas to navigate right now, depending on what the conditional use permit might be. And I don't even know if has been or will be land up for that kind of question, but just thinking, is there an effort, because that looks a little broad, is there an effort to really focus on not expanding vehicular traffic as much to make congestion worse, and then going back to other modes of active transit, pedestrian traffic, bicycle transit, really making sure that it's also streamlining how we integrate those things as well. And I don't know if that's a fair thing to add to a conditional use permit, but I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you.
And then one other topic related to this that I was curious. Oh, how I was reading through purpose and I didn't quite see this elsewhere. For the conditional use permit, I assume like everything else, we're looking for how it connects to the general plan, even in a broad way, correct?
We tend to, staff tends to put a general plan consistency discussion in everything. For instance, site plan and architectural review, we tend to have a section that talks about general plan, but technically when you go to the site plan and architectural review section of the code, it makes no mention of the general plan. Looking at how do we incorporate that reference so it's also a finding that is required.
Because one thing I wanted to ask specific for this, but also some of the other topics we've already covered, I've seen, at least with the other projects we have, you'll very generously put down in the report, usually nearer to the end, going through, well, it covers this key item or this key portion of the general plan. The thing is, having gone through the general plan a few times and responding in part to the point that Commissioner Ryder made as well, there are parts of a general plan that really made sense in the 90s. Like the push for retail, like reading that general plan, there is a love for stores that I don't quite understand, but I guess, it's a time capsule in itself. And I'm just thinking with conditional use, but other projects, being able to rank or prioritize where certain elements might almost seem contradictory to what we're trying to do now. If there is a way or some kind of mechanism for us to rank priority based on the conditions we're experiencing now, that might be a great way to add to our flexibility. Well, technically adhering to the plan, but also acknowledging there's certain parts of it that we'd rather leave in the past. And maybe what I'm proposing is a little too broad, and that might be functionally difficult, but I just wanted to throw it out there.
And I think some of that is kind of a case by case, analysis in the staff report when there are sections. And I think we do try to do this in terms of like, if there's a section that doesn't quite, sometimes you will see staff's kind of response on something saying, well, the intent appears to have been this, there's a changed condition, or while it doesn't meet it exactly, it has achieved that intent through this other way. So that is like duly noted, and I'm not sure how to codify something like that, but I definitely think that just the feedback and response to general plan policies in a staff report could kind of touch on that when needed.
And one more thing, and this is just off of Councilmember Fisher's comment. We have the list of accepted uses. It would be great to have to see work done to create a list of things we absolutely don't want for these. So a do and don't list, just to simplify where our kind of the gray area really ends up being. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hooper. And then I'll give some brief comments, and then we'll turn it back to anyone else who wants to weigh in. I actually think for CUPs in general, I think we need more of them. I think we need more flexibility on the commission. I think other uses and projects we should see more of as a CUP attached. You know, again, the tasting room conversation was an example that unfortunately I did not support last year, but I think we need to move in a direction that is greater public participation and flexibility, that the commission has more oversight on these bigger projects with the CUP. And I think some big things come to mind that I've brought up in past study sessions, but public health considerations. You know, Petaluma is one of the only cities in Sonoma County that does not have a tobacco retail license ordinance. We don't have any regulation on tobacco retailers and their density within the city where they are. So a CUP process could help with that. In addition, we have a tremendous amount of alcohol establishments in Petaluma. There's a ton of liquor stores. There's a ton of places to buy alcohol. And we have an issue overall in Sonoma County with binge drinking, but certainly here in Petaluma as well. And so we have no oversight over that. We have no land use oversight over those establishments. So again, I think bringing the CUP process into the fold on other projects is important for us. So that's my comments there. And Commissioner Potter, you wanted to weigh in again?
Oh, just briefly on the conditional use permits. I support that as a tool. I guess in today's discussion, I thought that we were talking more procedurally about changes to the zoning code that would happen now. And since we're in the middle of a general plan revision, I just would caution us from getting ahead of that, because once the general plan is set, there are going to be commensurate changes to the zoning code to reflect those decisions that are made in the general plan. So I just maybe to keep our conversation here more on the procedural steps of noticing and the findings that we've already talked about. But I definitely support when we get into the meat of how we want our community to look. We'll start with the general plan. We'll do the zoning amendments after, typically.
And Vice Chair Alonso, I just do want to make sure everyone knows that we do have I believe it's Chapter 8 in our IZO that is our alcohol, what's it called? Alcohol related. I'm forgetting the title of it specifically, but it does deal specifically with alcohol. There is community input to update it and increase the things that require a use permit. But there is oversight. For instance, you may remember, I'm not sure if you've been on long enough to have any of the gas stations come in and ask for alcohol, permits, public convenience and necessity to sell alcohol at gas stations. That has come in several times and we've denied several of them. So there is some oversight in our code through our alcohol ordinance.
Right. I would just argue it's very
not enough. Right.
It's not enough. And again, other communities are doing this. This isn't something that is some pie in the sky thing. And we should have the conversation now. I don't know if we can wait until 2023, 2024 for the general plan to be rolled out. So again, I'll just raise it because it's a study session. And, I think, hopefully the council will take that. And again, the tobacco retail license ordinance is a council priority as well. It just hasn't, for some reason, hasn't gotten through the door. Whereas other communities in our county are doing it and throughout the state. So we just need to act on that. And I think folks, for the public, I mean, these land use decisions are really important. And so I think just looking at it from a public health perspective, even in procedural matters, is really important. All right, let's move on to the next discussion topic, which looks like streamlining. Heather, you had some language in here about should the city expand the scope of projects processed under the administrative SPAR or minor CPU process?
Right, so just acknowledging that we do have administrative site plan and architectural review, and we do have a minor use permit process that's outlined in the code in chapter 24. It has some specific things that can be processed administratively. Just any input, whether you think that's a good list, if there's something you think is missing. Oftentimes, like I know that City of Santa Rosa really did a push to have more things processed at the administrative level in order to facilitate and encourage certain things. So just wanted to bring that up to see if that any input on that.
Any commissioners willing to, or I'll go. Okay, Commissioner Potter.
Well, I guess that my thought about that is, again, balancing the need for efficiency and incentives in government, and then the oversight that the Planning Commission provides when it comes, to the hearing. But I would like to think about the kinds of project elements that we are wanting to incentivize. For example, renewable energy, the installing of solar. I also feel like sometimes a project that already had SPAR review or conditional use permit that gets some kind of minor alteration that could have been administrative ends up coming back to the commission. And the commission is very busy with so many other initiatives at the policy level to take on that I could support some instances where there was an expansion of the administrative approvals, especially on the SPAR.
Thank you, Commissioner Potter. Anybody else? Or okay, Councilmember Fisher.
Well, I guess I'm feeling ill-informed here. So I don't know what those list of uses are or where I'm finding them. Maybe I'm not finding them because I was given the IZO just chapter 24.
So, yep, they're in IZO chapter 24. So SPAR, Site Plan and Architectural Review, is 24.010B. And that is really, it's a very limited list. So it's administrative site plan and architectural approval for non-production residential units, which means non-productive residential units means houses not substantially similar to other houses within view of one another, in an approved subdivision of 5 or more lots. All residential developments of less than 5 units. So if a new project came in that was 4 or so basically a 4-plex or fewer, that could be approved administratively, or minor additions or modifications to industrial, commercial, or office buildings.
Right. You said that in the beginning. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
And those minor additions or modifications, is there like a square footage associated with them or a?
No, it's really kind of at discretion. So a lot of it would be, how big is it compared to how big the existing is, or how visible of a street is it on, or, we definitely, there are also things that, if somebody is putting up a new awning, we'll do that with a building permit. So that, the idea is not to bring every single thing. So there is some discretion we use on what's so minor that it doesn't even touch on this. And then that next step, which is an administrative site plan and architectural review based on what is the project, what is the building, but this does not include residential. So minor modifications or minor additions or modifications to industrial, commercial, or office buildings.
Well, it should include residential as well, I think. Right, so if you're doing, is that the question? So if you're doing modifications or additions to residential of a certain size, that it wouldn't come before us, it would be staff approval.
Well, just to interject real quick, I thought it's less than 5 units. It would be administrative, right? Right, Heather?
Right, it is. So less than 5 units of new construction. So let's say you had, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of an apartment building and they want to do an addition onto an apartment building to add, you know, we don't get a lot of those, to be honest with you, but that would be one. I think what Commissioner Potter is referring to is things like the Adobe Road Winery, or it seems like we had another one where it's an approved project and then they want to make a change to the design, and what is kind of substantial conformance with what was approved and what goes beyond that. So there's always changes to projects from when they get their site plan and architectural approval and when it goes to building permit. It just, you know, once they get to that next level of complexity in drawings, there's almost always some changes, but there's a line when those modifications kind of become different than what was approved. And I always try to think, one of the commissioners that approved that project, once it's built and they were walking by, is that change big enough that they're gonna be like, wait a minute, I don't remember that, or I don't remember it being 4 stories. I thought it was 3 stories. Those are obvious things that we would not consider substantial conformance and we would bring back for input from the commission.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, another project that comes to mind, I guess it was a couple of years ago now, was the Ellis Street apartment next to the AT&T building. Was a very small, I think it was only 6 units, but because it was more than 5 came before us. So yeah.
Ellis Street?
Right?
Or was it Keokuk? No, not Keokuk. Liberty.
Sorry, Liberty, my
That
bad.
was 11 units.
11 units, okay.
10 or 11, yep. Mm-hmm.
Still small, pretty small. But yes, I think that, to my mind, that raises this very question of those types of projects coming before us, you know. Before I keep talking, anyone else want to weigh in? Yeah, hearing no one else. Yeah, I support more streamlining for residential construction. I think that makes sense. I think I'd be curious to know how long it's been 5 units or less. If that's just been around for a long time, because that's the number that was picked. But maybe we need to, in certain areas of the city, that can change. So I would be interested to know if other commissioners would support an increase in that number. I think I would be, depending on the type of project being proposed. And again, I think what's important is that folks can appeal. You know, the appeal process is clearly laid out, and it would come back to us anyway if there was an appeal from an administrative decision. So, and which would require a public hearing. So.
Well, I think that's a good question, Heather. Is there an appeal process for an administrative decision?
Yes, there is an appeal process. So any administrative decision is appealed to the Planning Commission. And then the way our code works, actually, you can then appeal the Planning Commission to the City Council. And that is sometimes how you find single family homes that get appealed all the way to the council, because we don't have a one appeal in our code.
So how does the community know about the administrative decisions?
So we do, it's published in the paper and it is sent to a 500-foot radius.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
And I don't know how long it's been, 4 units or fewer. I've been here 12 years and that hasn't changed in the last decade. So, you know, I don't know before that. I don't know, you know, we did the 2008 code update with when the general plan was adopted, the implementing zoning ordinance was adopted. So I think it was definitely then. I don't know if it was in the code before that or not.
Sounds good. Thank you. Commissioner Ryder.
So to reiterate before I make a fool of myself, I have not been here very long, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions. It strikes me as, you know, as we're leaning more and more away from single-family development, that this current streamlining of small single-family homes is actually the opposite of what we'd want to streamline. And I just wonder if there's a mechanism that we should consider and how my fellow commissioners would feel about it, and almost reversing it, frankly, or at least considering in a specific zoning locations where we can streamline for higher density.
One thing I would note, Commissioner Ryder, is it does talk about administrative site plan and architectural approval for non-production residential units in approved subdivisions of 5 or more lots. And so that would only be when a project is approved, the subdivision is approved. And 5 or more lots is key, because 5 or more lots is when a subdivision cannot be approved administratively. So a parcel map is 4 or fewer lots that can be approved administratively. 5 or more must be approved by the city council. And so it is the single family dwelling on single family lots that would have been approved by the city council. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Councilmember Fisher.
Well, I was going to weigh in on this, whether we increase the density of a housing project beyond 5 units to make it ministerial. And I don't know that the number of units is the right measurement, because it seems to me it's sort of thinking about the impact to the neighborhood, right? And thinking it in terms of wanting to really support the missing middle housing piece, and how do we craft that to be able to do that, to streamline those projects? So, you know, if it's an 8-plex in a certain zone, and I don't know if this is the place to do that, but I would like us to consider making it easier to build that middle affordable housing. And I see that as being part of our general plan and our zoning code update is, you know, providing for people being able to build 4-plexes and 8-plexes and garden apartments and that kind of thing more easily, since that's a piece that we really need. So I'll just blabble.
And that is something that staff could look into. We could look at how some other jurisdictions have done that, or what kind of the range of, and I do want to point out, it's not ministerial, it's administrative. Just, it does, just because then there's a notice and there's the ability to appeal and all of that kind of stuff. But we could dig around a little bit to see what other jurisdictions, what their threshold is, especially anyone that maybe has done an update more recently in response to, you know, the current both housing and climate context.
Yeah, I think somebody like Santa Monica, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
They've been out front for years. So.
Thank you, Councilmember. Commissioner Hooper.
Yeah, going off of Councilmember Fisher's point, one question I had, I understand it's less than 5 units to a subdivision. Is that, I understand that's plot of land. Is there a specific size of land measured for that, or is that just for, you know, generic to the plot that developer owns or that individual owns?
So the way the code currently is adopted, there's 2 things that it does. One, it allows SPAR of individual single-family homes on lots that are already approved, and ones where it's not that everything is matchy, but like it's almost like custom. I think of it as custom homes. So that's one thing that's allowed to be administrative. And then the other thing is actually new construction of a four or fewer. So that would be an apartment, could be condos, and it could be something on a parcel map, because a parcel map is also allowed administratively if it's 4 or fewer.
But is there specifically for the 4 or fewer segment of that, and thank you for clarifying, is there any kind of description as to the size of the land? I do have a reason for asking, I promise.
Well, that we have development standards in the code that's like lot coverage and setbacks and density and all of that. So it would have to be consistent with all of that.
Okay, and the only reason I ask is because, like, to Vice Chair Alonso's point, and to Councilmember Fisher's point, I can understand wanting to increase the number of units, but I also agree that increasing the number of units seems to be not quite the right measure. And the reason I asked those questions, because I was just wondering, is there a way to really focus on the density as a ratio of units to the lot size in that scenario? Or is that really already being done in this?
Well, you already have your, I mean, this might also be a case of there's more comfort to increase the administrative scope when we are more confident that the other aspects of our code represent the type of development we want. So for instance, right now we do have setbacks, we have lot coverage, we have usable open space, we have these metrics. Whether they are right, you know, or whether they're actually representing the development that Petaluma wants. And so maybe once we do a more substantial overhaul of our zoning code in response to our general plan, and we're setting those development standards in line with the vision we have for Petaluma, then maybe there's also an increased comfort level saying we're comfortable with more being done administratively because we know those metrics are where we need them to be. And so it's easier to let go of the more discretion and public hearings and that kind of stuff. So, you know, that might be a balancing right now, because right now we're kind of looking at the code and we're trying to address the things that we stumble over and over and over again, right? And in a way, it's a little bit of a piecemealing Band-Aids on our existing code. Hopefully after the general plan, we do a much more comprehensive update of the code. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. So, and it makes sense both in the description, but also just from the projects we've had up to this point in some of our discussions. It really does feel like we're kind of playing whack-a-mole with so many other things around this particular issue that it is hard to give into any kind of administrative procedure when we know there are so many things that don't quite align with the plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
All right. Any other comments or topics to address with the planning manager tonight on this agenda item? Okay. Oh, Councilmember Fisher, before a motion.
Well, we're just going to move to continue it, right, to July 27th. I just had a note about the pronouns, and I don't remember exactly where it was in here, but you referred to the director, and it's he, she. Yeah, we need to update that.
No, that's great point. Thank you.
All right, that's it.
All right, thank you, Councilmember. So I think right now at this point, we are going to end this agenda item pending a motion to continue. So we just need a commissioner to make that and have a second, and then we'll vote. Can someone
I'd love to continue?
Okay.
Happy to do that.
Okay, so Commissioner Ryder makes the motion, Commissioner Hooper seconds to continue this agenda item to a date certain for July 27th, 2021. And we'll take a roll call vote, please. Oh, Evelyn, you're on mute.
Yes, I know. I had to.
Oh, okay.
I had to do something over in Granicus. Sorry. Bauer, Alonso,
Yes.
Hooper,
Yes.
Marzo, Potter,
Aye.
Ryder,
Yes.
Fisher.
Aye.
All right, thank you. The motion passes 5-0. So we will revisit this item on July 27th. And thank you, staff, for the presentation and robust discussion. And we will continue on with our final agenda item tonight on short-term rentals.
Okay, that's me again. Let me find my PowerPoint. Okay, so before you is an actual zoning text amendment for IZO section 7.110, which is our short-term vacation rental section of our zoning code. So to give a little bit of background, the city of Petaluma first adopted short-term vacation rentals in 2015. And the ordinance included a sunset clause to provide assurance that the ordinance would be reviewed. There was considerable concern with neighbors when these regulations first came forward. There was concerns about over concentration of short-term vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods. There was concern about parking. There was concern about noise and concern about kind of creating party houses in Petaluma. So those were some of the things that came up. And one of the things the council did when they adopted this ordinance was to add a sunset clause that essentially gave it 2 years. And they wanted an opportunity to come back and discuss and make sure it was working for Petaluma before it moved forward. So in 2018, staff brought forward an update on the ordinance and how it was working and complaints or how many permits we had issued. And at that time, staff had recommended to remove the sunset clause, and the council wanted to continue to give it a little more time to make sure there were not unintended consequences. So they did a zoning text amendment that added 2 additional years to the sunset clause and extended it to 2020. So since adoption of the short-term vacation rental program, we have approved 115 permits. And this kind of gives you an overview of the new permits versus renewals. So we were doing about 10 a year. In 2017, at the end of 2017, the city hired Host Compliance because what we were getting a sense of is that there was a lot of short-term vacation rentals up on the various platforms, Airbnb, VRBO, that didn't have permits. And so the city hired Host Compliance to basically do enforcement. And so that's when you see that uptick. And we got new permits, 54 new permits in 2018. That was really in a response to that enforcement effort. So what I think it's important to note is that they don't all continue on. So the way our short-term vacation rental program is set up, it requires an annual renewal of your permit. And this was put into place really to be able to say, no, that short-term vacation rental isn't working. We get continuous complaints, that sort of thing. So it gives the city kind of a continuous loop to make sure that individual permits are abiding by their conditions, that they're not causing a lot of neighborhood complaints. So as you can see, I believe it was like November of 2015 when the ordinance was originally adopted. So there was a few that were approved in 2015, but they ran slightly longer than that year because they weren't until the very end of the year. So let's see, we had 21 approved in 2015 and 2016. So all of those came up for renewal, but only 14 actually renewed. So you can kind of see that each year there's not all of them renew and new ones come online. But that gives you a sense of the patterns of these permits and these renewals each year since we adopted the regulations. So we have not needed to use the revocation process that's in the code. We haven't revoked or denied renewal. We have had great luck both with host compliance, getting more of the short-term vacation rentals to register and get permits, and also with when we have needed code enforcement, go out and do code enforcement, and typically those issues are brought into compliance. So it has not been a program for Petaluma that's kind of a constant code enforcement or constant source of complaints in our neighborhoods. So let's see. So there was an error in the staff report that I want to kind of clear up. We have not issued any new permits in 2021, but there were 48 renewal applications that came in at the end of 2020 that were approved. So there are 48 renewals that were approved to run through 2021, and those were approved before we caught the sunset clause and realized that needed to come forward. So sunset clauses can be quite problematic in ordinances for exactly that reason. The city does not have a good tracking software to keep track of those and to kind of have ticklers that come up to bring them forward for renewal. And I think this is a good case demonstrating that. And then there's 4 new short-term vacation rental applications that have been submitted this year, but are pending until we either amend or eliminate the sunset clause and are able to approve those new short-term vacation rental permits. So based on the fact that we really do have minimal complaints, seems the number of permits seem relatively stable. We haven't seen a massive short-term vacation rental permitting or had a sense of real over-concentration in specific neighborhoods or heard those concerns from residents. The recommendation is to eliminate the sunset clause. This would allow the short-term vacation rental regulations to run as they're written. But as you know, any part of the code can be amended or modified at any time through a process. So it would allow them as written to run until any further action from the city to modify or eliminate the short-term vacation rental regulations. When the short-term vacation rental program was initially adopted, it was adopted in part because it complied with the general plan and the goals to expand tourism opportunities throughout the city, to support the vibrancy of the downtown by attracting new clientele, expanding opportunities to collect transient occupancy tax revenues. It's also something that was referenced in the economic development strategy that was adopted in 2010. So it was implementing lots of those feedback loops. And just to go back a little bit on its initial adoption, there was a pretty robust community outreach process when we were looking at these. We held a workshop prior to drafting the regulations where people were invited to come. We had quite a robust turnout, a lot of comments about what people's concerns were, what they would like to see or didn't want to see the city, and that really helped shape the regulations as they are today. So as in any zoning text amendment, the Planning Commission has broad discretion to recommend approval of the proposed amendment as proposed, to, instead of eliminating the sunset clause, to recommend modifying the sunset clause, some other alternate hybrid, or the recommendation to let the sunset clause run and to allow the short-term vacation rental program to basically sunset completely. And recommendation on a zoning text amendment is a simple majority to approve the resolution, with the discretion ultimately being at the city council to approve a zoning text amendment. Required findings around general plan consistency. This zoning text amendment is not considered a significant change in character of the current zoning regulations. It allows the existing short-term vacation rental program to continues to support that expanded tourism opportunities, as was initially some of the basis for creating this program back in 2015. Similarly, public necessity, convenience, and welfare. This is a pretty minor change that is being proposed to eliminate that sunset clause and allow the program to continue. Environmental review found exempt because of the minor nature of the zoning text amendment. It's not creating a new land use or creating new regulations, really allowing the existing regulations to continue. So it is recommended that the Planning Commission adopt a resolution recommending that the City Council approve a zoning text amendment to eliminate the sunset clause in implementing zoning ordinance section 7.110M, and allow the short-term vacation program to continue as currently codified. I'm happy to answer questions or talk about alternative options if that's the desire of the Commission.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Let's open public comment first, and then we'll bring it back to the commission. So if Mr. Roberts can open public comment for this agenda item.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. Provide a few moments for our attendees to raise their hands if they wish. I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'll conclude public comment for this item.
All right, thank you, Mr. Roberts, for moderating, and we will close public comment on the item 7B, and we will bring it back to the commission for questions or comments, and we'll start with Commissioner Potter. Oh, Commissioner, you're on mute.
I wanted to express my appreciation for this program. I think it's been very successful in Petaluma in meeting some of the goals of the general plan, as well as really stimulating the economy and providing some much needed TOT revenues. And it has been managed in a way that has avoided a lot of the pitfalls that we've seen in some of the other communities in Petaluma. And I am supportive of lifting the sunset clause, because we will have the opportunity during the general plan to talk about the whole manner in which we'd like to see a broad variety of visitor serving uses in the community. And if through that general plan process we have some changes to this part of the code, then that would be the time to do it.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner, for those comments. Commissioner Hooper.
Before my comments, I just wanted to ask a question, if that's all right. First question I wanted to ask, this sunsetted in 2020, and I was just curious, you said there were 4 permits or at least applications this year. Has there been any mechanism for process since it expired, or has it been just in a holding pattern since then?
It's been in a holding pattern. We did not see a lot because we were just coming out of COVID. So, it has been definitely not quite as robust a program while in COVID. So those have been really in a holding pattern until we could bring this forward.
And then I ask this question because I have seen this now go both ways depending on the community. When this ordinance was put in place, was this to regulate a right that was would have already been allowed for use in terms of what someone could have done just without any particular regulation for the community? Or was this to allow the use in the first place?
It was to allow short-term vacation rental in residential neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to confirm that. And then, and I only have a few questions. You actually answered 4 of my questions.
I tried. They
So
came in late, so I wasn't able to
No.
get a response out, but I was trying to hit on your questions.
Which I'm very grateful. That's why it's only a few more. You mentioned the lack of software for tracking the sunset, and I was just curious. I mean, I'm going to be horribly reductive with this, but couldn't planning work off of a calendar process with alerts, especially for sunsets and some of our clauses? I just ask because I'm trying to understand what aside from dealing with this specific date, obviously we've hit December 2020 already. I'm just trying to really make sure I understand clearly the goal in removing a sunset at all from this. And if software is an issue, I'm just wondering if there's other means we could go about helping with that so we're not basing our policy that way.
So a couple things. One is, yes, we don't have a specific, but we could put a tickler on our Outlook where, on October 1st, something goes off on my calendar to say, start preparing a zoning text amendment to update the sunset clause. I will say also, we have been trying to be so responsive to the changing context in Petaluma and put our resources and our prioritizations to what the community and the city council has been asking us to do. And so there is a lot of work and time put towards these type of zoning text amendments that if they're needed, they can be useful. And if they're not an issue, if they're not creating a problem, to take some things off so we can continue to have our focus on the bigger things that that we are being asked of. I personally think sometimes that's a better use of available resources. This has now been through, initial adoption and then one extension of that sunset clause. And my experience has been there is not a significant negative impact. We're not hearing from the community that, 5 of their neighbors have short-term vacation rentals and all of a sudden their neighborhood feels like a hotel row. Those were the concerns in the beginning, and they were valid concerns because it was new and it was different and people were not sure how it would impact their lives. So that's why we're recommending elimination, is just to kind of simplify and be able to focus on the other things that we're being asked to focus on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I just want to clarify, I'm grateful for the work that you and the rest of the staff are doing. I know we've given you a lot of asks, especially in the last few months. I'm very appreciative of that. I have one more question than my comment. It was just before this ordinance went into effect, I know that some of the factors for a permit include the zoning areas, requirements of business license, parking requirements, neighbor notification, and more. But just on the zoning level alone, and I was looking at the open GIS map today, but I was just curious, was there a rough estimate, even with the zoning as the basis, of how many potential units could theoretically become vacation rental? And I know that's a broad estimate. I'm just curious if that was, if not, that's fine.
I don't think that we ever looked at it quite that broadly.
The reason I asked some of these questions, and thank you again for answering some of my very late questions that I sent you today, is because while I do appreciate the point of how this has gone and how reduced this is, And I do appreciate Commissioner Potter's point about the general plan really being a place where some of this discussion should happen. I'm still very nervous about the housing crisis we're currently in, the RHNA numbers we have to meet next time around, plus what we already didn't really hit this last time. There are other policies in this community, in this county, that we renew regularly. Our green belts, urban growth boundaries. And I know it may seem worrisome, but I remember this was years ago. I was managing the canvas that would go out for Sonoma County Conservation Action. We would go to Guerneville and Forestville. I remember when the comments were similar. We're not seeing a lot of interest or permits being taken out. It's not a big deal. And then there was kind of a bubble investor moment where very quickly the area went from being community members we've been talking to for years to second home, not really second home, but folks from San Francisco essentially using it for places to go on the weekend, and whole properties being converted. Now, I know a lot has been done in this ordinance to be able to prevent some of that, but I would definitely push for an alternative for a regular cycle, at least a 2-year sunset cycle, because then it can simply go on the consent calendar. If things look fine, if you're not really seeing that change, you go on the council consent calendar, they can pass it without even a discussion. But having seen how things have worked here in the last few years, I'm very worried that if a problem does pop up, and considering we're coming out of COVID and people have cabin fever, and we've already seen it elsewhere where the scale of tourism has increased, and that's an artificial bubble, but it's still probably going to come. I worry that we won't have the mechanisms in place to be able to quickly make a change if we need to. And having a regular cycle for renewal, even just to give us that coverage, it prevents us from having to make a whole new ordinance amendment or bring up a new process when we know it's going to come up for review. So that's just what I would like to put forward instead of just nixing the sunset altogether. Thank you.
So Commissioner Hooper, just to interject, is there a specific timeline you want to propose in terms of a review?
Yes, I would like to see a 2-year cycle.
So, and that is completely within the Planning Commission's purview if they want to, instead of eliminate the sunset, to modify so it could be December 31st, 2022. I do want to point out that this is codified. It is an ordinance. So there is a minimum requirement that it come before the Planning Commission. It then come as a public hearing before the City Council for a first reading, and then a second reading, and then 30 days. So it's not just because the way it is an ordinance and it's codified, it's not able to be just put on a City Council consent agenda. And if there's another way to look at that, Dylan, I'm open to that. I'm just thinking of the way it's codified now, and that doesn't have to preclude that recommendation. I just want to be clear that because it's a zoning code, it has to be processed as a zoning text amendment, which requires Planning Commission recommendation, a public hearing, and only go on consent for the second reading if it's unanimous at the council at the first reading.
That's correct. We can maybe with the general plan amendment move this to not be in the zoning code. But yeah, currently as it stands, it would need to go through both bodies before being adopted.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. Quick question. Heather, you said that we had hired an enforcing company. Are they still on contract? Are we still doing that on a continual basis?
They are. Yes, I did check with Ingrid Alverde because it was out of economic development that was hired, and she did confirm that they still are, and they do periodic. Basically, they have software where they reconcile what they're seeing on the rental platforms with what we have permitted. And so then what they do is they send a notice out saying, we noticed you're not permitted. and you are, so please come in and get a permit. And then there's a second notice that goes out, and usually by then we get compliance, or they take their listing down.
And the renewals happen just at one time during the year, or is it sort of year round?
Right. No, they happen at the and Eric Roberts, if I misspeak, because Eric deals with this a lot more than I do on a day-to-day level, but they come in towards the end of the year, and then they're all processed at the beginning of January.
Gotcha. Okay.
They run with the calendar.
So essentially right now we have 48 in this city, right? So if I wanted to come visit here, I would have a choice of 20, 48. And I can say that over the last 6 months, when people started getting vaccinated, that was really the choice for coming to visit here, and mostly visiting family. I noticed, and I talked to a lot of tourists. It's like, oh, where are you from? What are you doing here? It's a lot of family visiting right now. I would be happy to remove the sunset clause. I don't have the same concerns that Commissioner Hooper has, and I do think it's time just to let it fly. So that's all.
Thank you, Councilmember Fisher. Commissioner Ryder, do you have any comments or questions?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay. Does someone want to make a motion?
I'll go ahead to motion to, oh, sorry, I'm supposed to raise my hand. I'll stop.
That's okay. You started talking already. So in real life, when we come to the council chambers, you would be the first person recognized because you started speaking. So we can have you keep going, Commissioner Ryder.
My apologies. We eventually will get used to this and then we'll stop. Okay. I was going to make a motion to remove the sunset clause for the short-term vacation rental.
And I'll
Okay.
second that.
Okay, Councilmember Fisher seconds. And any other further discussion on the motion? Hearing no further discussion, we will go to a roll call vote.
Okay, Bauer, Alonso,
No.
Hooper,
No.
Marzo, Potter,
Aye.
Ryder,
Yes.
Fisher.
Aye.
Okay. So the motion passes 3-2 in favor. So the motion carries, and at 9:32, that is the last agenda item. Anyone else have any further comment, or staff? Okay. Well, our next meeting's on July 13th. We will swear in a new commissioner then and select officers, liaisons, and handle the other business. So thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thank you.
The recording has stopped.